All right, we'll get started in just 1 minute. All right, good morning. And to those in the Middle East, good afternoon and good evening. Welcome to today's Mark Samuel and Distinguished Speaker Series conversation on Israel, Palestine, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. My name is Aaron Rosen, and I have the pleasure to serve as the president of the World Affairs Council of Miami. We are an independent, nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we work to enhance local access to high-quality information on international affairs. Before we get started, I'd like to address our reasoning for holding this conversation. Despite the tremendous global attention this topic receives, many in communities across the nation and beyond find it challenging to access informative and trustworthy information on the situation in the Middle East. Moreover, many share that it has become exceedingly difficult to have a respectful conversation that considers this conflict's various perspectives, resulting in many people shying away from discussing it altogether. Our goal with today's conversation is therefore twofold. Firstly, by inviting two experts and colleagues from the Middle East Institute, one of the world's foremost nonpartisan think tanks on the region, we hope that their analyses and observations will help to generate new understandings of the nuances and complexities of this conflict. And hopefully, they also will present some ideas for solutions. And secondly, by maintaining civility throughout today's session, we hope to demonstrate that it is possible, even critical, for people to discuss and even disagree without becoming disagreeable. Most of you tuning in today are Americans. That also matters. For decades, America has been Israel's strongest ally. At the same time, our country has long been an advocate for peaceful resolution to this conflict and a critical actor in peace negotiations between Israel and Palestine, as well as between Israel and other Arab states in the region. It is therefore, in my view, the responsibility of us as a friend, ally, and negotiator for peace to understand this conflict's many perspectives. Finally, I'll note that we should recognize the reality that the conversation we are having today, here largely in the peace and security of North America, is taking place during a period of immeasurable shock and grief in the Middle East. That's certainly true for Israelis, who suffered an unprecedented and atrocious terrorist attack by Hamas on October 7th, and is also true for Gazans, who now find themselves in a terrifying and lethal war zone amid Israel's military response. So with that in mind, I want to thank you all for joining us here today. We're grateful for your time and for your civility. We also encourage your participation. So please submit your questions through the Q&A system. Keep it respectful, and we'll work through them during the Q&A session toward the end of today's conversation. As we get started, I'd like to give a thanks to our partners, the World Affairs Council of Atlanta and the World Affairs Council of San Antonio, and to their leaders and my colleagues, Ricky and Armin, for partnering with us on this timely conversation. We are grateful for your collaboration and for helping us reach new audiences around the country. I'll now hand the mic over to Ricky and then to Armin for a few remarks and to introduce our speakers, and then I'll be returning to moderate today's conversation. Ricky, the floor is yours. Ricky?
Yes, hi, I'm so sorry to be joining late. I had some technical difficulties. May I just ask that Armin introduce his guest speaker first, and then I introduce Dr. Goren?
Sure, no problem.
No problem, Ricky. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Aaron and your team for including us in this very special program. I'm really thrilled to see what the World Affairs Council of Miami is doing as one of our newest in the affiliate. So congratulations to Aaron and his team. What he's doing today is indicative of his superb leadership as part of the network. So thank you, Aaron, for including us. My name is Armin Babajanian with the World Affairs Council in San Antonio, and I serve as the CEO. And I'm here to say a few words about Khaled Elgindy. He's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. He directs MEI's program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He's the author of a newly released book in 2019 called Blind Spot: America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump. And that's available on hardback on Amazon because I just saw it. He is previously served as a fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution. Prior to that, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009, and was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 and 2008. Mr. Elgindy is also an adjunct professor in Arab studies at Georgetown University. He has his publications, he has a wide range of them in foreign policy, foreign affairs, the LA Times, as well as numerous television appearances on news networks. And I'm happy to introduce him. And full disclosure, we visited the MEI a few years ago as part of the national network during our visit there, and we really appreciate having these esteemed panelists to talk about a very important issue. And I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague and friend from Atlanta, Ricky Bevington. Thank you.
Thank you, Armin, and thanks to all of you for your patience as I was rebooting. I think we've all been there before. We're now 3 years into regular Zooms. I will echo Armin's statements. Welcome to the network, to the World Affairs Council of Miami. Not brand new, but new, and Aaron and his teams are doing extraordinary work there. And it's such a privilege for the World Affairs Council of Atlanta to be partnering with San Antonio and Miami on this very important topic. So welcome to our guests. Welcome to the Atlantans who are among us in the audience. And of course, welcome to our speakers. I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Nimrod Goren, who's Senior Fellow for Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute. Dr. Goren is the president and founder of Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, co-founder of Diplomeds, the Council for Mediterranean Diplomacy, and co-chair of a regional initiative at President Isaac Herzog's Israeli Climate Forum. Dr. Goren holds a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and was a Hubert Humphrey Fellow at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He was a teaching fellow on Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University and has also worked at the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace, the Jerusalem Institute for Israel Studies, and the Nehemiah Levtzion Center for Islamic Studies. And as you can imagine, his bio goes on more and more, but I will pause there because I think the most important thing for us is to listen to these two experts from MEI, share their perspectives on what's happening in the Middle East. And I will turn it back over to Aaron. Once again, welcome to our guests and to our speakers, and thank you for the privilege of having the World Affairs Council of Atlanta co-sponsor this event.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, Armin. So without further ado, Nimrod and Khaled, thank you both for joining us here today. I echo the words of my colleagues in Atlanta and San Antonio. I'd like to dive into things, but before getting to the contemporary issues unfolding in real time in the Middle East, I'd like to first travel back into recent history to help us understand how we got here. I'll set this a little bit just by explaining that, after the First and Second World Wars, European decolonization took place across the Middle East. In Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and others, these states gained their independence. And in 1947, in one of its first tasks since its creation, the UN recommended partitioning a sliver of previously British-controlled land on the Eastern Mediterranean into two states, one Arab and one Jewish, with Jerusalem as a special international zone. The first question for Nimrod is, how are we to understand what happened next, and why didn't that original plan become a reality? What instead developed into its place? I'll also have a follow-up question for Khaled, but feel free to also, if there's anything you'd like to add to each other's answers, to chime in as well too. Nimrod?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. It's a pleasure being with you all here, and I appreciate the initiative to bring us together and to foster this engagement, this dialogue with your communities, hopefully with a focus on opportunities and positive things that may happen despite the dire days that we are all in. So I appreciate that. And of course, the history of the conflict is a long and complicated one. I think the key date is 1967, the Six-Day War, in which basically Israel occupies territories from different countries, but especially the Palestinian ones that we are still trying to resolve this issue until this day. And despite a decade of progress towards peace in the 1990s, following the 1993 Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO, with Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, that process did not eventually yield a final status agreement of a two-state solution that was attempted to be reached at the 2000 Camp David summit. And then we enter like a period of 20 years that's basically setting the stage to what we see now, with some failed attempts to renew negotiations, to reach a progress through negotiations, but basically with now a decade or so without any peace talks happening between Israelis and Palestinians officially, of a decade and a half, even more, of a divide between the West Bank under the leadership of the Palestinian Authority and the Gaza Strip under Hamas, of consecutive years and governments of right-wing control in Israel, with governments that do not support progress towards the two-state solution, and in years in which the international community did not find a meaningful way to engage with this conflict. We are now basically debating peace plans that were introduced 20 years ago, even more, whether it's the Clinton parameters, the Quartet roadmap, the Arab Peace Initiative. All those key documents are more than 20 years old, with not really new ones being introduced since. So that's kind of the reality, and it led to different rounds of escalation and warfare, especially between Israel and Hamas, but also to tensions and violence in the West Bank. So the overall environment is not one in which progress was made between Israelis and Palestinians, but rather transformation was happening between Israel and the region. And over the last few years, we saw Israel-Arab relations opening up with the Abraham Accords, normalization agreement with Morocco, with Bahrain, with the UAE, progress with the Saudis, other countries that have been gradually opening up formally or not formally, peace treaties that have been signed before, with Egypt first, with Jordan later. So Israel's regional relations have been transformed, but its relation with the Palestinians have been going backward. And I think this is the consequence that we are seeing now, and hopefully this will be changed in the future.
Absolutely, and we'll dig into a lot of those issues, specifically the regional elements, the Abraham Accords, and the more recent peace processes. But for those tuning in, I want to still dial in a little bit to some of the historical context to help people understand kind of how we got to this point, the sort of backstory. And Khaled, for example, for you, I'd like to ask, after the partition of the land into an Arab and Jewish state, and the first Arab-Israeli war, what followed in the Middle East, and particularly in Arab language media and in Arab societies, is considered this Nakba. What should we understand happened to the Arab communities, and how did they come to find themselves after this initial partition plan was implemented, and then the reality that came after this war?
Thanks for that. The first thing I would say is that the partition plan was not actually implemented. The partition plan was a recommendation by the General Assembly. It was not necessarily binding, but it was clearly, represented not necessarily the consensus, but the wishes of an important segment of the international community. Partition was never really about two states. It was primarily about fulfilling the demands of the Zionist movement to establish a Jewish state in some or all of Palestine. The Zionist movement settled on a portion, although the amount of land, Jewish, mostly refugees who fled Europe, made up less than a third of the population, and yet the partition plan gave them 55% of the land of the British Mandate of Palestine. One of the many reasons that the Palestinian majority rejected the partition plan. But the partition plan itself was mainly about creating a Jewish state. Both Palestinians and the Arab states rejected the partition, which they saw as an infringement on the self-determination of the indigenous population of Palestinians. What happened actually was a war in two phases after the partition resolution was adopted. The first phase was a civil war between Arab and Jewish communities inside Palestine, and that lasted until May. It continued, but it was overshadowed in May of 1948 when Israel officially declared its independence, and at that point, Arab states entered the fray. But throughout this process, including during the Civil War period, the majority of the Arab population of Palestine was expelled or forced to flee and prevented from returning thereafter. That event is known to Palestinians as the Nakba. It is the sort of foundational moment in terms of Palestinian national consciousness in which Arab Palestine was destroyed and the bulk of its population was dispossessed. Nakba is Arabic for calamity or catastrophe, so which went hand in hand with Israel's creation. Over the next, I think it's relevant to talk about the Nakba because events today are being referred to by Palestinians as another Nakba. I think it is as searing a moment in Palestinian consciousness as the events of 1948. And of course, it's still ongoing. Obviously, there's a lot to cover since 1948, but since you asked specifically about that, that is one of the two pillars of this conflict. We mostly talk about the dispossession of Palestinians in 1948 and the inability of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. That's one component. The other component happened in 1967 with the occupation by Israel militarily of what remained of Arab Palestine, namely the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. The West Bank had been controlled by Jordan after 1948, and Gaza was under Egyptian military rule. So that kind of completed this capture of historic Palestine from the Palestinian vantage point, and now Palestinians were scattered in the region as refugees or under Israeli military occupation in the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza, and then another constituency of Palestinians inside Israel who became citizens of Israel, those who didn't flee in 1948, but were relegated essentially to second-class status. So those are, I guess, the two most important events in this conflict. The peace process since then has really been about 1967, and that is trying to end Israel's occupation and establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, or on most of them anyway. And that process has been ongoing. That peace process was ongoing for 30 years. Depending on when exactly, we decide to point, where the Oslo process collapsed. But we've, as Nimrod said, we've had no meaningful peace process for a very long time, and that is one of the drivers of the events that we saw since October 7th.
Absolutely, and we'll certainly get to that as well too. I really do appreciate the historical context. I think that we're here trying to get a bit beyond the headlines and to dig a bit deeper into some of the fundamental issues here. So you touched, Khaled, on the West Bank and Gaza and the evolution of their status, first as areas that were Arab designated for a Palestinian state, and then becoming controlled by Jordan and Egypt, respectively, before coming under Israeli military occupation. I think that's something that people are not as aware about. And I was wondering, maybe Nimrod, back to you, if you could share a bit of like how that happened, right? For people who are not living in the Middle East or not specialized in it, how do these regions go from designated for an Arab Palestine to a Jordanian and Egyptian to now, under Israeli occupation in this sort of in-between status? How did that happen?
I think Khaled mentioned the key events leading to that. We saw how the UN partition plan was not implemented, and then the consequences of the 1967 war. I think it was interesting to see how those countries that initially controlled the West Bank and Gaza eventually said that they are basically moving the responsibility on how they said to the Palestinian leadership. You remember King Hussein of Jordan in the late 1980s, after the beginning of the Palestinian Intifada, the first one, going on camera saying the West Bank will not come back to Jordan because it was a Jordanian ruled territory before 1967, but his message was this is now a Palestinian issue. And if Israel wants to negotiate, if Israel wants to reach peace, the answer is not in Jordan. And similarly, we see even today during the war, the Egyptian consistency in not wanting by any means to have any responsibility regarding the future of the Gaza Strip. So those countries that used to control those territories eventually said that's not our aspiration to go back to that situation. So Israel has been in control of those territories since 1967. And we have seen that it's not only the military control of them and the occupation, but also the building of settlements for different motivation by different people. You know, it began with governments as soon as the labor ones in 1970s, the left wing, the center-left governments that Israel had at the time, from security consideration, but with a strong ideological component by the religious right, especially, that was motivated to create facts on the ground, showing that the entire state of Eretz Israel, what is called, is supposed to be under the state of Israel control. So that was the settlement project that evolved, and that led to a lot of debates within Israel about, you know, which settlements are necessary, where should they be, which are of security value and which are not. It came up in different negotiations that took place along the years, different concepts about possible evacuation and possible swaps of land. And we see when Israel disengaged from Gaza in 2005, there was evacuation of Israeli settlement. I think it was the only major incident in which that happened. And that remains a major issue when we are trying to think about the possibility of a two-state solution. What does it mean with all those Israelis still living, you know, in the West Bank for the future of possibility of a peace agreement?
Thank you both for that. The last element of this, sort of the prehistory, I want to just touch on is, you know, this initial Arab-Israeli war and the territorial shifts led to huge demographic shifts as well too, right? Many Jews who had lived in Arab societies for centuries would leave or flee their homes and become Israelis. At the same time, the UN established a new refugee agency explicitly to serve the many Palestinians who had been displaced or expelled during the war and now found themselves living as refugees, many in Jordan, Syria, or Lebanon. I was wondering for both of you, so Nimrod, how did this war impact the dynamics of who became Israeli and who became Palestinian, both of which at that time were fairly modern political identities? And Khaled, to what degree has Palestinian identity been integrated into and shaped by those neighboring states that absorbed, you know, millions, hundreds of thousands to millions collectively of Palestinians into Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon? Maybe Nimrod, you can go first, and then Khaled.
Sure, I will take a first part, Aaron, about the influx of Jews into the state of Israel. So basically the Zionist movement, beginning decades before Israel was formally established, was based on Jews moving to what will be Israel from different locations, some of which the Jewish communities were here in the region for years, for hundreds of years. But major immigration waves came from Europe and from other countries in the region. And of course, when Israel was established and the war with the Arab countries was at full-fledged, there were communities that were leaving the Arab countries, not being welcome there anymore. And we saw influx coming from Morocco to Iraq and other countries. So that changed the demographic, but it's also a constant factor in how Israel evolved societally and demographically. And we say it going on all the way to the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with a large influx of immigrants from there. So that's part of the Israeli identity of Israel being a home for the Jewish people, for Jews in need, for Jews that want to feel safe within their community and in their homeland. So that was the open doors policy, what is called the Chok HaShvut. And Israel's population demography has changed throughout the years because of that. And that also has consequences of political preferences and nature along the years.
Thank you, Nimrod. Khaled, yeah.
I'm not sure what the focus of your question that you'd like me to answer was.
the degree to which the Palestinian identity has been shaped by or integrated into those neighboring states after the influx of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. How that shaped Palestinian identity?
Well, I mean, what shaped Palestinian identity was, I mean, there was a kind of Palestine-focused identity before 1948 that existed, that had been cultivated, particularly since the British took over the mandate and established a mandate for Palestine, and in combination with the growth of the Zionist movement and colonization of Palestine, that triggered a kind of nationalist impulse, initially felt on a kind of pan-Arab level, but was later became much more defined and centered around a political entity called Palestine and a Palestinian identity. The events of 1948 really cemented that identity. The experience of the Nakba, the large-scale dispossession of Palestinians, whether or not they had left, was now kind of seared into the Palestinian consciousness. The third of the Palestinian population that remained, almost all of them had relatives who had fled, or in some cases, even the people who remained had lost their lands. And so every Palestinian was affected by this moment. And so the hope, I think, of the Zionist movement was that the Arab refugees would become that. They would just simply dissolve into the countries that they were in, because, you know, Arabs are Arabs. But that's not what happened. The Palestinians who fled maintained a distinctively Palestinian identity in Jordan, in Lebanon, and that, of course, was also nurtured by the emergence of autonomous Palestinian nationalist groups like Fatah that emerged in the 1950s and 60s, Fatah and others, that then cultivated those constituencies as you know, as part of their political bases, and that's where we get really the origins of the modern Palestinian national movement happen in they're sort of I guess cultivated in the crucible of the Palestinian refugee camps in places like Jordan and Lebanon, but also in the broader diaspora, in the universities and cafes of Kuwait and Cairo or Beirut. This is where Palestinian political elite emerge, and so it's really during this period of the 1950s and 60s that the modern Palestinian national movement is born. Of course, it doesn't yet include groups like Hamas, which come about with the rise of political Islam in the 1980s. But it is part of this gradual evolution of Palestinian politics.
Thank you very much for that detailed answer. Moving us a little bit more toward the present day, I'd like to focus briefly on the peace talks. If we allow ourselves to be charitable, and we always should, we can say that, you know, especially considering some of the views you both have expressed so far, it's clear that the situation that has developed today between Israel and Palestine is far from what either side initially had in mind. To that end, peace talks have been ongoing for decades, as you both mentioned, to try to solve many of the issues we've discussed, whether it's rule over Gaza, West Bank, status of refugees, or Jerusalem, you know, you name it. Khaled, I wanted to touch on this from your perspective initially. You know, from 2004 to 2009, you served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership on the negotiations of many of these issues. In your opinion, why have so many of these critical issues remained unsolved? And maybe as a kind of spark for hope and restarting things, when did we perhaps become closest to settling things?
It's an interesting question. there are lots of reasons why the peace process failed at different moments, or why negotiations didn't succeed. I think the power asymmetry is a key factor that people often overlook. There's a tendency, even in the United States, and even among very smart people who are seasoned diplomats and negotiators, there's a tendency to think that if we just bring Palestinian and Israeli leaders into a room and force them to talk, that they can come out with some kind of negotiated compromise. But a negotiation process or a diplomatic process always is its success or failure always depends on events and forces both inside and outside of the negotiating room. And in this case, you have a situation where you have an occupier and an occupied people. And so they're not negotiating on even terms, and they're also not negotiating on even terms under the auspices of the United States, which, as everyone knows, is Israel's closest ally, and there's a longstanding special relationship. Now, the expectation was that the United States, given its influence with Israel, would be able to help level the playing field on some level, and deliver Israel through whatever mechanisms it needed, providing Israel with security assurances or diplomatic cover, but that the U.S. was crucial to bringing Israel to a position where it was ready to make these broad, difficult compromises, like handing over sovereignty over large parts of what many Israelis view as the biblical heartland, of dividing Jerusalem, of finding some accommodation for Palestinian refugees, including some maybe even symbolic, but some sort of return of Palestinian refugees. These are all very difficult things. Also, things like evacuating very large numbers of settlers. These are not easy things, but it was felt that the United States, if anyone could convince Israel to do these things, it was the United States. That's not how the peace process played out. It played out more as you might expect, given the political and power dynamics of two best friends, the United States and Israel, kind of having each other's back. And so when things went wrong, the tendency was, more than a tendency, I think it was almost always, to blame the Palestinians. They were the weak link in this entire arrangement. So the peace process itself, I think, was structurally flawed. It wasn't necessarily predestined to fail. I think it could have succeeded. And to answer your second question, the one moment I think that Palestinians and Israelis came the closest, either before or since, to a conflict-ending resolution or peace deal was in late 2000, early 2001, after the collapse of the Camp David summit, which most people remember as having been, that lost opportunity. But the reality is that the more serious negotiation process took place in the subsequent months after Camp David collapsed. Unfortunately, it was also when we saw the outbreak of the second Palestinian Intifada or uprising, and so there was greater urgency on the one hand of the parties to reach a deal. President Clinton was also in the last few weeks and months of his administration, so he felt the need to kind of clinch his legacy. But for one reason or another, it didn't happen. But I think that was the moment, probably with the Clinton parameters in late December of 2000, and then right up until the moment that Clinton left office in a month later, that was the window in which a deal could have been consecrated. But for reasons related to the domestic politics of both sides, the ongoing violence, there were lots of reasons why it wasn't going to happen. But I don't think there's ever been a moment that that the parties were closer to reaching a deal. I think since then, particularly the Annapolis negotiations that I was a part of, that was a much more of a performative exercise. It was kind of political theater, and nobody really thought it would succeed.
Thank you very much. Nimrod, from an Israeli perspective, I mean, how is that viewed? What have been, similar question, what have been the main obstacles? And when in Israeli kind of collective society, when was the view that we are the closest to where we have ever come to peace?
I think it depends how Israelis define the conflict. What is the length to which they understand what is going on between Israel and the region? And you see competing lenses on that, and the leadership or the prominence of each is changing along the years. There is the religious lens. Okay, is this a Jewish-Muslim conflict? There is a broader regional one. Is it an Israeli-Arab? Is it an Israeli-Palestinian? Is it territorial or ideological? So the way you define basically the conflict leads to your willingness or readiness to make some compromises, or even to believe that prospects of peace are out there. Because if it's a religious conflict, it's zero-sum. And I think the zero-sum approach was very dominant in Israeli society for years. And remember the Khartoum Arab League summit after the Six-Day War, talking about the three no's, no's for peace, for recognition, for negotiation. So the sense in Israel is that there is no one in the Arab world that will be ever willing to accept Israel's existence in the region and live in peace with it. Now that began to transform, especially with the visit of Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, to Israel several years after the Yom Kippur of 1973, eventually leading to the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab country, and the major Arab country at the time, with Egypt in 1979. So that shattered that belief that Israel-Arab relations are doomed to be one of conflict and war forever. So it impacted domestic discourse in Israel. It led to the emergence of a peace camp that really advocated also to engage with the PLO in the 80s, in the late 80s especially. And eventually that changed the debate into a political one, into one that involves which concessions could and should Israel make, and what Israel will get in return, and how reassured we are that if Israel does the concessions for peace and adopts the land for peace formula and withdraws from territories and evacuates settlements, will that enhance its security or jeopardize its security? So the security emerged as a major concern for the Israeli public. That has been the case since the establishment of Israel, and that is the basic existential fear in the Israeli society. How do we make sure that by doing this agreement with our Arab neighbors, we are not taking a risk that will eventually damage Israel's security? That's the framing. In terms of an opportunity, I think the years immediately after Oslo, even though the Oslo Accords in 1993 were just the beginning of a process, it was a mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO. It began a gradual process of some Israeli withdrawal and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. It wasn't even talking about a two-state solution, but in the Israeli mindset, that was the opening. We had a strong leader, Yitzhak Rabin, who could face public pressure. We had an assumption that there is a partner emerging on the Palestinian side, despite all the skepticism about Yasser Arafat at the time. And maybe the specific point was just before the assassination of Rabin in 1995, when Yossi Beilin and Mahmoud Abbas, the current Palestinian president, understood that the gradual nature of the Oslo process is not constructive to efforts for peace, because it meant that if you keep only the sensitive topics to be dealt with at the end of the process, the extremists have a chance to spoil the process as it goes on, and they want to create a shortcut and go all the way to the key issues and reach an agreement quickly. And that was presented to Peres just after the assassination of Rabin, and it didn't fly. It was mostly behind the scene, but I think in terms of a point of time in which Israeli and Palestinian leaders could have made a jump, that was the time. Later on, of course, there were a lot of expectations and hope in Israel towards the Camp David summit led by Ehud Barak at the time. After some years of Netanyahu in power from 96 to 99, we came back to a center-left leader, a pro-peace leader, Ehud Barak. But the way the Camp David summit was conducted was not what it enabled this agreement to be reached. So Israel was seemingly willing to go quite far ahead toward Palestinian demands, but not all the way, plus the assumption that the Palestinians will never agree to make all that Israel wants them to in terms of ending the conflict, no more terror, ensuring the security. So all of those components eventually changed the Israeli mindset, made it more open to engagement with the region and the Palestinians, but not as much as needed in order to seal a final status agreement.
Thank you very much to both of you. Bringing things back to the present, I wanted to touch on two political points, one on Palestine and one on Israel, before we start discussing the ongoing war in Gaza. Khaled, for you first, the current Palestinian government has been in power in the West Bank since 2007. Many critics of the Palestinian Authority's leadership claim it is out of touch, corrupt, and incapable of shifting the paradigm. And so its partners, including in the US and also in Israel, are, to my understanding, concerned that if the West Bank were to call a general election, more likely than not, Fatah, the ruling party, would lose, and something more radical would take power. That's often the narrative that we hear. How do you see it, and should the West Bank call an election? And if so, what can we expect?
It's a good question. The question of Palestinian leadership, or lack thereof, really is central to understanding where we are. I think most people understand that Palestinians have been divided since 2007, with Hamas controlling and operating its own authority in the Gaza Strip since 2007. And they had split off from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank under the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas. So that split has been highly detrimental, obviously, to Palestinians. It's an incredible source of weakness, and one of the reasons that diplomacy hasn't worked, because you have a divided Palestinian leadership. You don't need a PhD in political science to understand that a leadership that is weak and divided is not going to be able to make broad sweeping compromises in negotiations with a far stronger adversary like Israel. So that weakness, but it has also been a problem in terms of stability. The fact that Hamas has been outside of Palestinian institutional politics, it is not a member of the PLO. The PLO is supposed to have been the central umbrella for the Palestinian national movement, where all Palestinian factions operate, and therefore is considered the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority is not that. The Palestinian Authority is a technical administrative body, at least initially, that was charged with governing parts of the occupied territories, leading up to, eventually graduating to full statehood once an agreement was reached. Of course, that state never came, and so but at that point, the Palestinian Authority had become de facto the political address of the Palestinian people, and the PLO was allowed to was basically sidelined and allowed to decay. So that's part of the context, is these weak institutions, both the PA and the PLO. My own belief is that that line between the Palestinian Authority and the PLO needs to be reestablished. The Palestinian Authority should not be the political address of the Palestinian national movement, in part because it doesn't make sense, because it's not truly representative. It doesn't include, for example, any representation of or possibility for refugees to participate in it. But also it's too weak and divided to serve as an interlocutor with the Israelis, in large part because Hamas won a democratic election in 2006. The international community congratulated the Palestinians on holding a democratic election, and then proceeded to boycott that new government that was run by Hamas. So it kind of, Hamas's election exposed a number of contradictions in the peace process, in Hamas's own agenda. Why would they, the fact that a group that had violently opposed Oslo was now in charge of the main institution established by the Oslo process. And also the many contradictions within Palestinian politics. More broadly, the fact that Hamas was not a member of the PLO was highly problematic. In any case, I think the way forward is not necessarily an election, because as you said, Hamas was actually growing in popularity even before October 7th. Certainly now it is its popularity has surged, particularly in the West Bank, but also elsewhere. It's one of the reasons why the stated goal of destroying Hamas entirely is simply not achievable. You can't bomb a political movement or set of ideas out of existence. There will always be new leaders and new weapons, as long as there is a need for that kind of resistance because of an ongoing occupation and blockade and so forth. So with that in mind, I think an election, although it is seems logical to expect at some point down the road, as part of the Gaza reconstruction process in a year or in 2 years' time, people talk about the need for elections. I'm not sure that elections are the answer, because elections are partly how we got into this mess in the first place, in terms of the Palestinian division. So if you're going to have elections, it matters elections for what? Elections for the PA or elections for the actual political leadership, which is the PLO. I think it's much more, and then what happens if Hamas wins those elections, or frankly, at this point, even if Hamas participates in those elections, that will be a red line for Israel and probably the United States as well. So we're really kind of in a bind where there's no way forward in Palestinian politics with Hamas, but also no way forward without them. And so ultimately, I think what needs to happen is to reestablish this division between the Palestinian Authority on the one hand, which needs to be downgraded into a kind of service providing entity that can operate, that is not political, that does not belong to or run by or include members of any political faction, and therefore would be allowed to receive donor assistance and operate in the occupied territories. Whereas the logical place for Hamas would be to join the PLO, like all political factions, and to become part of the institutional Palestinian politics there, and that obviously Israel and the United States would also object to that, but it really internal Palestinian politics should not be subject to a veto, certainly by Israel, but it's crucial, I think, to have a reformed PLO that is inclusive and genuinely representative. That's important for Palestinians because they lack real leadership. Mahmoud Abbas's leadership has been quite disastrous in its many failures, and so only a revived PLO, I think, that is inclusive can truly represent the needs and interests of Palestinians, and that can also serve as an interlocutor and peace partner with Israel or others.
Thank you very much. Last question for you, Nimrod, on the political before we start looking at the military conflict happening in Gaza. Looking over now to Israel, more recently, critics of the Netanyahu government claim that the Israeli government has been disinterested in advancing the peace process. You yourself mentioned that a bit earlier, and has chosen instead, at best, to quote unquote manage the conflict, and at worst, at times to exacerbate it through the expansion of settlements in the West Bank. Do you think these criticisms are an accurate assessment? If not, how would you describe Israel's approach to the conflict more recently? And if this is accurate, you touched on this briefly, but I was wondering if you could share a bit more of when did the Israeli government's approach to the conflict change from attempting to solve it to, like, let's say, conflict management?
Because of the skepticism about the prospects of actually achieving a two-state solution, I think most Israeli governments were operating through a conflict management approach. Some made more attempts than others to move towards resolution. But again, I think they were mostly satisfied with gradual progress being made and with levels of coordination and cooperation being established with the Palestinian Authority. Because we do see that throughout the conflict, the Israelis and the Palestinian leadership managed to coordinate between themselves on security issues, on economic issues, and this is continuing even despite difficult days happening. Okay, I think the current Israeli government is quite unique in terms of what we saw before. We have a government that is in place for 1 year now. It's the most extreme right-wing government that we had. It includes in top ministerial positions people that were seen as illegitimate within the Israeli political discourse a couple of years ago. Okay, we're talking specifically on ministers like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich coming for the real far extreme right of Israeli politics. And there is a reason for that. It's not as if the entire Israeli electorate has shifted there. It's partly because of what happened to Netanyahu during his years of governing Israel. And Netanyahu has been in power almost consecutively for nearly a decade and a half. And Netanyahu, which traditionally tried to establish coalitions that include a more centrist party besides him along the years, could not do it anymore when he entered this trial that he is now facing on corruption. So when Netanyahu became a persona non grata in the political map in Israel outside of his own electoral base, and even within parts of his electoral base, when he had to establish a government, he picked and chose those parties that were willing to go towards a judicial overhaul process that will help him get an exit from his trial. So Netanyahu aligned with the radicals because of personal interest, and the national good is not necessarily the one that has been guiding this government. And what we saw over the last year in Israel is a very strong pushback by pro-democracy factors in our society against attempt to undermine Israeli democracy. And we saw a judicial overhaul aimed at changing the way our legal system works in a way that will enable changes that will enable in turn Netanyahu to get off the hook in terms of his legal problems. And that process that Israel underwent throughout the last year impacted social cohesion within our society. It impacts Israel's security and well-being, and eventually it brought Israel to a point at which it was more vulnerable to what happened on October 7th. So the policy of the current government is definitely against the two-state solution, but it's not as if the previous government that had more moderate factors within them were all in towards that. We can contrast that, for example, to the previous government led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. Again, that was a government that didn't last for very long, but it was kind of a break in those consecutive years of Netanyahu in power. It was the first time in Israel's history that we had such a broad range of ideology within one coalition, from Meretz on the left to the Naftali Bennett's party on the right, people with very different approaches toward the two-state solution. Some wanting a two-state solution, others calling for annexation, sitting together in the same coalition, and that coalition made its goal to govern, to be excelling at good governance. And while doing so, it enabled to restore relations with the Palestinian Authority on the official level, to a level that wasn't achieved by previous Netanyahu governments. So you saw ministers talking with each other, you saw director generals and the high-level bureaucratic officials engaging with each other. So while managing the conflict, you can do different things. And you can manage the conflict to a sense in which you try to promote your interests on the ground. You can manage it in a way that enables more openings with regional countries and with the Palestinians themselves. But in order to make the transformation towards real peace with the Palestinians, you definitely need to see political will that you do not see at the moment among the Israeli leadership. Now, this political will is not only among the government, it's also among the public, because the public should see that as a priority. And currently the Israeli public, and we will maybe talk about it a bit later, is on one hand moving to the right in terms of ideology, but on the other hand moving to the center in terms of electoral behavior. So there are chances that after this war, and if political change happens in Israel, you will see a more centrist and moderate government, but not necessarily one that will be more geared initially towards a two-state solution.
Thank you very much. Moving things now toward Gaza, understanding the conversation thus far, it seems reasonable to understand that both the Israeli government and the Palestinian side have kind of settled into the status quo. At the same time, Gaza and the situation surrounding Gaza had become more and more complicated, as we discussed, following Israeli disengagement and withdrawal of settlers in 2005. Palestinians established local administrative rule. Shortly thereafter, in 2006, Hamas won local elections and thereafter violently expelled their Palestinian rivals from the territory. Since then, they have ruled Gaza administratively, and there's been on and off again war between Israel and Gaza, bringing us up to October 7th. My question is really for both of you, but we'll start with Khaled. How should we understand the motivation for the October 7th attack? And why do you think it was, militarily speaking, why do you think it was so successful? Or another way of looking at that is, why did Israel seem so unprepared for that? First, Khaled, and then maybe Nimrod, I'll hand it over to you for maybe an Israeli perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks. I think the motive, the primary motive of Hamas in carrying out the October 7th attack was to deliver a shock to the Israeli system. And in that it succeeded. Clearly did so on a scale maybe even that they themselves had not anticipated. It's not clear. Obviously, there's a lot we don't know about the internal decision-making of what went into and who decided to carry out this attack. Obviously, it was many years in the planning. But it's becoming increasingly clear that even the political wing of Hamas was not really aware of this operation, and that the military wing really kind of carried out essentially a coup by doing this, by acting on its own. Of course, if that's the case, we don't know for certain. But the motivation was clearly to deliver this shock, to shake Israelis out of this sense of complacency. We talked a little bit about the status quo. The status quo is extremely comfortable for Israel, for the Israeli leadership, for the Israeli public. The Israelis, basically had forgotten about the Palestinians. It was a non-issue as far as Israeli politics was concerned. And even in the broader region, it's one of, the fact that Arab states were willing to normalize was another sign to the Israelis that the Palestinian issue is not an obstacle anymore. The Biden administration had completely neglected the issue, was not a priority for them. As long as essentially the costs of the status quo were borne primarily or exclusively by Palestinians, then it was quite comfortable. Certainly comfortable for the Israelis, and by extension, it was comfortable for the United States, but it was decidedly not comfortable for Palestinian people, who in the West Bank were already facing now the worst violence by the army and settlers in 20 years. And of course, since then, it's gotten considerably worse. And in Gaza, as we know, over the past decade and a half, we've had these frequent eruptions of outbursts of violence, in large part because of this 16-year-old blockade that Israel has imposed on Gaza by air, land, and sea, and that has effectively destroyed the economy in Gaza, has created a humanitarian crisis. Of course, all of that now pales in comparison to what is the catastrophic conditions that we're seeing now. But this was part of Hamas's calculus that, everybody's comfortable with the status quo except us, and so we need to shake things up. Obviously, they did so in a very dramatic and brutal way. I don't think. I mean, again, we don't know much about their decision-making process, but it's hard to imagine. Well, anyway, again, we can't speculate about what they were thinking, but it succeeded in obviously delivering that shock and shaking Israelis out of their complacency. I think it's impossible to overstate what a colossal security and intelligence failure it is People sometimes compare it to 9/11. I think it is many times greater than 9/11 as an intelligence failure, because this isn't something happening in a cave tens of thousands of miles away. This is right under Israel's nose, in one of the most heavily surveilled geographic spaces on Earth. It was quite stunning that Israeli intelligence and security didn't have any sign. Well, of course, now we know that there were signs, but that they were ignored or downplayed. So that is a failure for which there will also be a political cost. Obviously, Nimrod can talk to that, I think, in terms of Netanyahu's future. But from the standpoint of Hamas, the primary aim was to put the Palestinian issue back on the international agenda. And they clearly have done that. We now have everybody talking about a way forward after this horrific nightmare unfolding before us in Gaza is over. But of course, it has come at an enormous cost. I think everyone expected Israel to react disproportionately, because that is part of its military doctrine, is that what it views as deterrence is in effect to create disproportionate damage, including to the civilian population. What we've seen, I think, has exceeded anybody's worst nightmares in terms of the scale of the destruction and death that is being inflicted on Gaza. And it's quite telling. Reasonable people can disagree, but it's quite telling that we are hearing from actual scholars of the Holocaust and genocide scholars use the term genocide. UN officials, human rights officials, others are using the term genocide in relation to Gaza. That should give all of us pause. We've gone far beyond anything that could be reasonably considered self-defense, and we are looking at something more like genocide and ethnic cleansing. There is a real risk that Palestinians, 80% of whom have already been uprooted in Gaza from their homes and subject to constant bombardment, there's a real risk that some or all of those Palestinians will be pushed over into across the border into Egypt. And we know that at least some in the Israeli leadership would welcome that, and in fact would like to see that happen. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Khaled. Nimrod, looking at things from the Israeli perspective, how would you see the response, the reaction to the October 7th attack, but also, the understanding of what motivated these attacks against Israeli society? What are people saying in Israel amongst, your friends, your colleagues, and your family? How do you see that?
It's the most deadliest day that Israel has faced since its establishment and since the Holocaust, October 7th. So it's a horrible day for Israel's history. It's impacted each and every Israeli. Everybody suffered something. People lost loved ones, people have people kidnapped, relatives serving in the military in Gaza. So it's all over the place, and it's an experience that we didn't see before. It wasn't the brutal terror that was done, because we've seen all kind of wars throughout Israel's history, but Israel never suffered anything like that. And the testimonies coming out of what happened to people inflicted by Hamas on October 7th are unbelievable. Really horrible stories. So that's the sense of shattering the basic sense of security. And I mentioned before how much security is an essential component and a major need for Israelis, and deciding to live in Israel and move to Israel. And now Israelis have been losing that sense of security. So that horrible nature of the day, I think, led to a decision that the regional realities should be reshaped. Okay, that was what leading to the war objectives as defined by the Israeli leadership, which are basically making sure that Hamas will not continue to govern Gaza, that Hamas will not be able to launch any more military operations against Israel, and to bring back home those Israelis that are held hostage by Hamas. So those are the three military objectives around which there is widespread support in Israel, causing political divides. Because it's a sense that the concept that were before October 7th are not proved to be failure. Whether it's the diplomatic or political priorities or policies of the Netanyahu government about how to deal with the Palestinian issue, sidelining it, enshrining the division between the West Bank and Gaza, even enabling Hamas to be more empowered by Qatari support, etc. Those have failed, but also the security establishment and ability to provide Israel with the security that it needs. And that leads to a decision made just days before October 7th by the government in allocating troops from the Gaza border to protecting settlers in the West Bank, which is a highly divisive political decision, basically motivated by the composition of the government and pressure by some of the ministers there, and the inability to read correctly the intelligence map that apparently was there. Okay, the Israelis were very much in the concept that Hamas will not launch an attack against Israel, and we misread some developments in previous cycles of violence with Gaza over the last couple of years. So that was a magnitude of failure. A failure that is now clearly being attributed to Prime Minister Netanyahu, both in terms of his policies before, of his conduct around October 7, and even his conduct after the war began. Very much focusing on political survival and not engaging the way Israelis want their leadership to engage with them in such a terrible time. So that's kind of where Israelis are at. They are rallying around the war objectives. They are not rallying around the leader. That is still quite a significant level of trust in the IDF, in the Israeli military. Despite the failure of October 7, Israelis believe that the war objective could be met. They understand that in order to topple Hamas from governing, again, not eliminating the organization altogether. I think that was voiced in the early days, but now it's being understood that that's not really the goal. But taking them out of power requires action within populated Gaza. And I think for Israelis on the peace camp, that creates a paradox because those who want peace, but find themselves supporting causes of war. And when we debate this paradox, we are looking for international friends. And we see support in Israel's war objectives coming from President Biden, coming from the EU, coming from other European leaders, and behind closed doors, also coming from regional allies in the Arab world. There is a big gap between what is being said by Arab leaders out in public and what is being said in closed doors, in closed conversation. Until now, it was only Bahrain who clearly, as far as I remember, condemned Hamas. Clearly, other Arab leaders did not condemn Hamas. So the notion that you can be pro-Palestinian and critical of Israel but still condemn Hamas is not something we see played out among the Arab leadership much until now. So that's kind of the sense of where Israelis are. But we also look at those Western leaders that support the Israeli war objectives for alternative courses of action. Okay, if the US and the EU support the notion of Hamas not ruling Gaza anymore, but are critical of the way that Israel is conducting its military operation, what other tools could Israel use, or the international community can use in order to make that objective happen? And I think in that regard, Israel does not hear other alternatives, and therefore I think it has the support eventually of those Western allies for the military operation that is being done. And Israel is kind of attentive to that, and we see the back and forth between the Biden administration and the current Israeli government that now also includes a centrist party that joined the emergency cabinet in making sure that key American demands, mostly on the humanitarian issues, are being met in a way that Israel will continue to have this credit from the Western allies to continue its operation, even expand it to new territories. And regarding the issue of possible refugee flow to Egypt, I think there is very high understanding in Israel of the importance of maintaining the good relations with Egypt. There was quite a bit of tensions between Israel and Egypt in the early days of war, partly because of all kind of esoteric ministers that put out individual statements about pushing Palestinians to Sinai. That was not welcomed by the Egyptians, to say the least, but it does not represent official Israeli policy. And I think from that on, we saw like an attempt by Israel to bridge those differences with Egypt and take into account Egyptian concerns, as Israel was doing in the past, give the Egyptians the credit for the good work they did in the release of hostages, of quite a number of Israeli hostages during the week before us. So that's kind of the realities. But with all the sorrow about what is happening in Gaza, and many Israelis care about well-being of Palestinians, there still is an understanding that this is the war that was launched upon us, and that Hamas should be out of power, and Israelis support what needs to be done in order for that to be achieved.
Thank you very much. Looking at things a bit more from the regional perspective before we open up for questions, I'd like to take a look at the broader geopolitical situation. We've talked about that proponents of Palestinian statehood have at times been critical of the shift in the Middle East, where new economic interest as well as common concern over Iran led to these new relationships between Israel and Arab states like Bahrain, UAE, Morocco, and others. These negotiations were, of course, heavily supported by the Trump administration, but also continuously by the Biden administration as well, too. I'm wondering, Nimrod, from your side, do you see, you touched on this a bit, but do you see this process as having now stalled because of the reemergence of a division between, let's say, the Arab world and the Israeli world? And Khaled, for you, I'm curious, some Middle East watchers have claimed that Iran, of course, a longtime funder of both Hamas and also Hezbollah in Lebanon, is sort of behind in some way or another the newest round of fighting. How accurate is that claim that, Iran wanted this to happen to discourage the further Arab-Israeli rapprochement, so to speak? How should we understand Iran's role in this? And while you're answering those two questions, we already received a few audience questions, but if there are other questions, feel free to submit them and we'll start working through them. Thank you. Maybe Nimrod, you go first on that, and then
Sure.
yeah.
I see Israel-Arab relations continuing. Okay, I don't see a stop, and I think there was a concern in Israel, especially when this government was elected, that those relations that were fostered by the previous government and by Netanyahu before will be coming to an end. We definitely saw things slowing down under this government. We saw regional forums like the Negev Forum, which includes Israel and some of those countries with which it has peace and normalized relations. That forum was not convening during the past year, so problems began before the war. But nevertheless, those Arab countries have decided to have peace agreement with Israel and normalized relation with it. And I think the motivation goes far beyond Iran, and the issue began way before the Trump administration came into office. It was a really gradual process that we saw over the last decade and a half happening, especially with the UAE. With Morocco, there is also in history. Israel had relations with many Arab countries in the 1990s, in the days between the Oslo Accords and the Second Intifada, so it's not entirely new, but the strategic decision by those Arab countries to have formal relations with Israel still holds. And many of those Arab countries were not that focused on the Palestinian issue before, and they may be more focused on that in the years to come. I think some of them, especially the UAE, has quite a bit of tensions with the current leadership of the Palestinian Authority, but may be motivated to take part in shaping the next Palestinian leadership, the identity of which. And for that, they may be willing to invest capacity that they weren't willing to invest before. So the interests are there. Relationships are still going on. We saw President Herzog just a few days ago going to the COP28 climate conference at the UAE, meeting with the leader over there, shaking hands with the Qataris. These are things that were not happening openly for years before. They cannot be taken for granted this time. We see tension with Jordan, but we see relationship continue. We saw tensions with Egypt, but they have been overcome. So the relations overall are proving to be resilient. It's not easy to maintain the level of Israel-Arab relations that was there before during times of war, but as some Arab people say, it's like opening a parenthesis. That's what we heard. Now we're like in this parenthesis phase, but once it's over, and especially if what happens after this war is leadership change also in Israel and renewed progress towards some kind of better relation with the Palestinians, I think that will require closer coordination between Israel and Arab countries in trying to reshape the new regional realities and in heavy involvement of Arab countries in what happens within the Palestinian territories in order to try and make progress towards peace. So I think even the Saudis, about which we have heard a lot over the last year in terms of opening up to Israel, I think even that process will continue, and we heard statements that after the war, the Saudi leadership is still motivated to carry through. So despite the problem, I think Israel-Arab relations will continue and will not be stopped in light of this.
Thank you very much. Khaled, your thoughts particularly about the, let's say, the allegations of the Iran angle. How do you see that as a Middle East expert?
Well, I mean, briefly, the Iran question is, there's a lot we don't know, but I think it's becoming increasingly clear that Iran did not have foreknowledge of this operation. Hamas, it was quite closely held it seems, by the folks in Hamas who designed and carried out this operation. Obviously, Hamas relies considerably on all sorts of support from for its operations in general from Iran, but there's nothing to suggest that Iran was privy to, or that it sanctioned or even ordered this kind of an operation. It seems to be entirely internally driven within Hamas. Of course, Iran is not particularly upset about the damage done to Israelis on October 7th. But I also don't think that I don't think the Abraham Accords or the normalization trend that we were seeing was the primary motivation for Hamas to carry out this attack in the first place. I mean, think it was there in the background, but I think it was part of the overall sense of complacency that Hamas was targeting, the sense that you could bypass the Palestinian issue and move directly, for Arab states to move directly to normalization with Israel. I think is part of what Hamas was challenging. And I think they did. I think they did that. I have a slightly different view than Nimrod. I think it's much, of course, it's not going to torpedo the normalization track entirely, but it makes events unfolding now in Gaza makes any kind of normalization very, very difficult. Not because Arab leaders really care all that much about the Palestinian people. They don't frankly care all that much about their own people. These are deeply authoritarian regimes. But they do care about public opinion because and they understand that right now the Arab world is seething. The Arab street, if you will, is quite angry. And we saw in the first few weeks of this war protests re-emerging in Tahrir Square in Cairo. The Egyptian regime has put a stop to that. They've banned those protests. Those were the largest protests since the Arab Spring a decade or more ago. And so they understand how potent the Palestinian issue is in terms of its public resonance. And the scenes unfolding on people's TV screens and iPads and phones are quite horrifying. And it's happening on a daily basis. And so it's impossible for Arab states to ignore that anger that is directed not just at Israel, but also at the United States. And also in terms of the United States, their approach up until October 7th had been that it was possible to bypass the Palestinian issue and focus in on these normalization deals. They felt that a Saudi-Israel deal was within reach, perhaps even imminent, and that the Palestinian issue was not going to be a problem. It was not going to be an obstacle anymore. That entire approach has now been completely upended. There is no Arab state, I think, that is going to make any significant gestures toward Israel while Palestinians in Gaza are certainly under bombardment, but also facing the kind of catastrophic humanitarian conditions that they're under and that are not likely to go away even after the bombing ends. This is going to be Gaza is going to be a problem that haunts obviously Palestinians first and foremost, but it will also haunt Israel and the region for many years to come. This is not like the previous rounds of violence where there's a ceasefire deal and then everyone goes back more or less to the status quo ante. This will have long-lasting, devastating impacts in terms of security, We all know that Israel wants to destroy Hamas, but they've not given much thought to what will fill the security and governance vacuum left behind. The notion that this level of destruction, 68% of buildings, of structures in Gaza have been partially or totally destroyed. Obviously, the uprooting of 80% of Gaza's population, the killing of tens of thousands of people. It's hard to imagine a scenario in which, even when the bombing stops, that there will somehow be stability. It's actually mind-blowing that anyone thinks that this level of death and destruction will somehow bring peace and security to anyone, rather than the opposite. We've seen this happen before. When you have a security vacuum, far more radical groups will fill that vacuum. I expect to see a sort of prolonged, maybe lower level insurgency on the ground in Gaza, which will also prevent any kind of reconstruction or rehabilitation or normalcy in Gaza. I expect that to continue for years, possibly. So there is no end in sight to the situation. I don't think the region will simply revert back to the way things were. Gaza is going to be an ongoing humanitarian and security problem for everyone in the region.
Thank you, Khaled. That actually touches on our first audience question. So we've grouped together some of these questions to try to more efficiently go through them. I would ask for both of our participants to try to answer these concisely. That way we can work through quite a few of them, because there's a couple that we've got and we want to try to get to as many as we can. The first question, actually, Khaled, you already addressed. So maybe Nimrod, I'll have you give your perspective, because it's one of the main critical questions, which is what outcomes should we expect from the current war in Gaza? So Khaled, you perfectly ended on that note from your side. I wonder if Nimrod, you could maybe touch on that, and then for both of you to try to keep the answers going forward for the Q&A round concise, so we can work through a few of them. Thank you.
We can expect going through different phases. Okay, so the situation, the issue will, as Khaled mentioned, remain on the regional agenda for a while, but things will change, and we need to find a way to shape how things are evolving, because it's a new situation. So it's not only about speculating where they can go, but actually doing work in order to try and steer them to the right direction, together with local, regional, and international partners. So currently there is the fighting stage going on, and that will go on, and from an Israeli perspective, it will continue. I think the war objectives are met. Okay, I think Hamas, and whatever you want to define the victor over Hamas, and that's a question mark in Israel, how do you know when Hamas is no longer governing Gaza and not anymore posing a military threat? But once Israel defines that as an objective that have been met, the fighting stage will change. So from high intensity fighting, you may move to lower intensity fighting, a more kind of security, keeping the security on the Israeli border in a way that will enable Israelis to come back to their houses before and do the reconstruction within Israel and rebuild the sense of security. So from the fighting, you will go into the transition phase. And I think the transition phase is where those discussion about how the future of Gaza will be shaped will be held with Israel and regional actors, and the revitalization of the PA in whatever manner will be decided upon, and investment by other countries from the Gulf and elsewhere. So that will be the transition, and from that transition, once a new reality is being set, and once a new governing structure will be spelled out for Gaza, hopefully with a gradual return of a Palestinian Authority, which is capable, more legitimate, moderate, and able to rule Gaza. If that happens, and in parallel a political change in Israel happens, then you can return to engagement. Engagement meaning Israeli-Palestinian talks on reaching a peace agreement. It won't happen immediately. It will take time. It requires a lot of issues, but that is a sequence from fighting to transition to engagement. And in order to ensure that each phase is successfully completed, there are things that could be done already now. For example, the issue of a diplomatic horizon for a two-state solution by the international community is something that is very important to happen even during the fighting phase, to show commitment by the international community to the idea of a two-state solution, and to show willingness for sustained mediation, because often we see, and Khaled mentioned the lack of effective mediation or involvement of the international community. We often see the mediators come in at points of crisis, but are not following through once the sustained engagement is needed. So doing that, but also presenting the benefits of peace. And I will mention very shortly the Peace Day effort that was launched before the war, and is seemingly less relevant a multilateral attempt at producing a package of international incentives for peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. Spelling out the benefits of peace will be important when transitioning from fighting to engagement.
Thank you very much. Khaled, for you, another question is, why have suggestions of the UAE administering Gaza during a post-war reconstruction phase been non-starters? And I suppose that kind of more broadly can be extrapolated towards the idea of any type of non-Palestinian Arab, administration of these areas.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of an Arab force, some kind of multilateral Arab force, either peacekeeping or governing Gaza or some sort of role, has been floated really since the beginning of this entire crisis. But it's mainly opposed by the countries themselves. I don't think Arab states are interested in going in and being responsible for a mess that Israel created. And many of them will actually say that in so many words. It's not about the UAE in particular. Obviously, the UAE is going to be a country that people turn to in terms of financing and reconstruction, and it can play a role there. But on the ground, as a peacekeeping or governing force or a security force, I think it's not reasonable to ask the UAE or any country to clean up the mess that Israel created. I mean, this is, this part of the planning for the war. I mean, what we're seeing is a war that Israel has launched under forces of rage and vengeance, not one that has been clearly or deliberately thought out in terms of an actual achievable military and political set of objectives. We see that every day in the pronouncements in the kind of absolutist, eradicationist pronouncements of the Israeli leadership, who even speak often in genocidal terms. And so we're not talking necessarily about rational decision making, but it would have made more sense if the military strategy had also included some thought as to what happens the day after. Here we are 2 months into this war, and only now are Israelis responding to American pleas to please start thinking about what's going to fill the vacuum that you're creating. They're not necessarily interested in that. They don't really care about Palestinian civilians or governance or security. And so, but the responsibility lies, I think, with the people who created the problem. Certainly, the region can play an important role, but no one's going to step in and fix a problem that Israel created.
Thank you. The next question here, we've condensed Nimrod, this will go back to you. American popular sentiment is more fractured now in its support of Israel than when compared to recent history. In the potential event of future waning American support for Israel, or just a more, let's say, less strong support than previously existed, how might that change things in Israel and with regard to Israeli-Palestinian relations and the overall peace process?
Currently, Israel formally enjoys a very strong American support. So, public opinion trends aside, in terms of policy making, from day one, President Biden stepped up very clearly, supporting Israel's positions and goals and objectives. And yes, the U.S. was asking Israel to think about an exit strategy and about the day after, but that's something that, it makes sense that when a war was launched on Israel, until Israel figures out its priorities, it takes time. And then again, those Israelis leading the government now will not necessarily be the ones that will be implementing that. So if we are talking, we spoke about the future of Netanyahu, for Netanyahu to define the day after, maybe not relevant, because we are looking for a new leadership that will have different approaches for the day after. So there is a question mark when we ask Israelis to think about the day after, who should provide the answers, and whether such answers are also provided by other actors in the region. So that's one thing I think to continue remembering. And then the American support, the assumption is that it will continue. And we know the changes, and we see what's happening in the progressive camp in the US and what is happening in American campuses, and legitimization of Hamas and denial of what happened to Israelis. That is a very difficult blow to many Israelis who look at the US not only in terms of leadership, but also in terms of society. Will that make an impact on American support for Israel? Doesn't seem so in the short term. Will the US put all kinds of conditions on what Israel cannot do during this war? I think it already happened. And I think Israel abides by that, generally speaking, in a way that ensures continued support to it. And the American support is vital. If it erodes, it will be more difficult to Israel to achieve its goals.
Thank you, Nimrod. Khaled, back to you. We have a question which says, in the interest of looking toward a hopeful future in which peace is possible, how should the Israeli public reasonably view the prospect of providing concessions, I suppose territorial concessions, given the previous failure since Israel's disengagement from Gaza in the mid-2000s?
Well, the problem with the disengagement from Gaza is that it was conducted unilaterally and outside of a diplomatic process that, a broader political process. It was someone who was there during the Gaza disengagement and was part of those discussions. Israel made it clear that it was leaving Gaza on its own. It was not interested in negotiating that process with the Palestinian side, and was also very much not interested in Gaza leading to a bigger political process, which is something the Palestinian leadership had been pushing for. And also the way the Gaza disengagement was carried out, in which essentially the border was closed after Israel left, the agreement on movement and access that would have allowed some kind of reasonably normal flow of people and goods in and out of Gaza was abandoned, not implemented by the Israeli side. And that's when we start to see the violence and instability escalate from Gaza. So the lesson from Gaza disengagement isn't that Israel shouldn't cede territory in return for peace, but that it should do so in the context of a broader political process. But also, it can't simply leave the territory and continue to control all of life inside that territory, right? That's not, which is what Israel did. It withdrew its forces, but it still maintained control over almost every aspect of life inside Gaza. So what's more important than redeployment of Israeli forces or even evacuating settlements is freedom. Actual territorial withdrawal that involves freedom and self-determination for Palestinians is something that would, I think, lead to peace, a permanent peace between Israelis and Palestinians. But that's currently not on the table. There is no Israeli government or future government that we can imagine that is willing to make those kinds of concessions, to both withdraw from the overwhelming majority of the West Bank, to divide Jerusalem, to hand sovereignty to a Palestinian leadership, and to allow Palestinians to live in freedom. That's not on the table anywhere in Israeli politics. Most of Israeli politics is, in fact, now post two-state solution, and are simply looking at maintaining the status quo indefinitely, which is the reality on the ground is one of apartheid, in which one group dominates permanently another group who are denied their basic rights and freedoms. So if that's the future, obviously there really isn't much chance for peace.
we're unfortunately out of time, but I'd like to end touching on one of the questions which was asked and expanding on it, which it maybe leaves us on a more positive note of assistance and help. We were asked, what can be done to help civilians, and I would say civilians in Israel and in Gaza that are facing tremendous risk to their lives, their livelihoods. I wanted to maybe pass it back to you both for closing remarks on things that people here in the United States can do to help civilians impacted by this conflict. Nimrod?
There's quite a bit of initiatives that provide chance to support in terms of donation and professional assistance to Israelis in need. There's quite a lot of need in that. I think the Jewish federations are playing a significant role in that. It could be contact. Looking beyond that, I think the revitalization of Israeli-Palestinian civil society engagement, this is something that will definitely be needed after this war is over, because I do think the responsibility is to try and create those paths to peace and to a two-state solution. Those involved bringing back those within both societies that are willing to engage and talk with each other, to have them meet each other and talk. And for that to happen, international community and international actors have a role to play in enabling that and convening that, in supporting that. So I hope this will become a priority after the current phase of fighting is ending.
Thank you, Nimrod. And Khaled, for you, and then after your remarks, I'll ask all of our panelists and hosts to turn on their cameras. We'll take a quick closing photo of the panel, and then we'll sign off.
Thanks. I mean, there are lots of ways to help civilians on the ground through charities. There's UNRWA, which is the UN agency that is working on the ground, the World Food Program. Other UN agencies are all working in Gaza, as well as private charities like the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. But really, the number one thing that can help civilians right now is an immediate ceasefire. That's the only thing that can prevent further atrocities and save whatever may be left of Gaza. It's impossible, again, to overstate what an enormous humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding right now in Gaza. UN officials are warning us that we've already seen the killing of 17,000 Palestinians at least, including 7,000 children. We're likely to lose that many people just from the spread of disease and hunger alone, in addition to the nonstop bombardment. So it's imperative, I think, on the international community, on people to demand of their elected representatives, since there really is no resolution that is going to be satisfactory to Israel politically, there needs to be an immediate ceasefire. And that's really the only political or human option presently, because Israel will not achieve its stated goals.
Khaled and Nimrod, thank you both for your participation today. Thank you all for those who have attended. We know that this is clearly a difficult topic, but we hope that we were able to have a conversation with multiple perspectives that shared some new information and provided something new. I'll ask the panelists to hop on briefly and turn their cameras on, and we'll take a quick group photo. Everyone's camera is on. Perfect. Great. Well, let's get a quick photo. Thank you all. And with that, we'll close out the session. I just wanted to say, thank you again, Nimrod, Khaled, Ricky, Armin. Thank you to Nathan and Michaela on my side as well too. We appreciate everyone's assistance. This conversation is very heavy, but critical, and we're really glad to be a platform to have these kind of conversations. We understand that everyone will not always agree, but it's conversations that need to be had. And if you only have conversations with people you agree with, nothing ever happens anyway. So that's kind of the point. So thank you all very much. We appreciate the support of the Middle East Institute as well too. And with that, we'll close off the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.